good to be with you this evening, and I hope our time together is well worth your effort, not only for your own personal lives, but also to be able to help others. In fact, I've noticed that if we just take this information ourselves and utilize it, we can be blessed. But if we take this information and share it, we're actually quadruply blessed. And so hopefully you'll be able to share this tactfully with others as well. Our opening text tonight is Revelation 22, verse 4. And they shall see his face, says the Revelator, and his name shall be where? In their foreheads. Now, why in their foreheads? Well, of course, the brain is there, but particularly a certain part of the brain called the frontal lobe of the brain, which we'll be talking about tonight. The frontal lobe is really what encompasses wisdom. And there was a comparison in the Bible of wisdom versus rubies. Wisdom is the comprehension of what is true or right, coupled with optimum judgment as to action. Rubies are distinguished for their bright red color, being the most famed and fabled red gemstone. Besides for its bright color, it's a most durable gem due to its hardness, durability, luster, and rarity. And thus people used to preserve their wealth and try to grow their wealth by buying rubies. Transparent rubies of large sizes are even rarer than diamonds, and as a result can bring an exorbitant price in the millions of dollars. Rubies, of course, is a focus on money and wealth. And I don't know how it is in South Africa, but I know in America there's a lot of focus on the economy. And why are we focused on the economy? Are we really afraid of not having food, shelter, or clothing? Is that the fear of the news broadcasters as they continue to talk about the economy? Actually, that's not so much the fear. But the reason why there's a lot of focus on it is because people assume that income equals happiness. The higher your wages, the happier you are. That's what they assume. Actually, studies don't reveal that at all, but that's the assumption that's there. In fact, studies have taken a look at it, and once you have the basic needs provided, in other words, once you have food and shelter and sufficient warmth to survive, more money does not bring significantly more happiness. It can, in the short term, bring a little bit more happiness, but eventually your happiness scale goes back down to the place where it would have been exactly where it was if you didn't have that big influx of cash or money. But yet, we have this distorted thought often that income equals happiness, which isn't quite true. And if it's not income, often we think it's assets that equal happiness. If I just have a nicer car, if I just have the most beautiful house, I will indeed then be happy. And again, once you get that car, there's issues. And soon you come back down to that same level of happiness. So this massive attention and focus on money is actually due to a distorted way of thinking. And I don't know how it is in South Africa, but in America, there's been a focus on gold lately. And why all this focus on gold? That's just, again, a focus on money. And then personal decisions that people make will often be based solely upon this. They'll change jobs and even travel long distances to be away from their family so that they can have a little more money. And sometimes they're not looking at the global perspective. It's just the income potential that makes them or that leads them to a decision sometimes that is not the best. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on money at all, But what I am saying is it should not be the number one priority. The last commandment in the Bible was, "Thou shalt not covet." And it's interesting. This is a commandment that is not about action. It's about what? It's actually about our thoughts. It tells us that the Lord is interested in our thoughts. He tells us not to covet possessions, not to covet people, not to covet position, the 3 Ps. By the way, that's part of the problems that we have in our countries today. I'll just tell you the way America was founded. It was never intended by the founding fathers that someone would actually campaign to run for president. The founding fathers in our country thought anyone who's arrogant enough to think that they could be the best leader is probably not going to be the best leader. And so they put a system in place where you would choose an honest, upright, faithful person in your district to caucus with others to choose the president. And of course, our first presidents were chosen that way. George Washington never wanted to be president. In fact, he said, "Please choose someone else." And they said, "No, you're the man for this position." And he said, "I'm only going to do it for 2 terms. You'll need to find someone else after that." And as a result, of course, he was a great president, as those who did not seek the position often were. Now, this last commandment, "Thou shalt not covet," some call it the sin that is actually not committed. Again, it proves the Lord is interested in your thoughts, but Christ also mentioned this commandment. In Luke chapter 12, he said, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesses." That is not going to be one of the hallmarks of which our characters are judged. But billions of dollars are spent every month. You can see the last time I gave this talk was in Michigan. But billions of dollars are spent, I'm sure, every month in South Africa as well, to try to get you to covet. There's billboards, there's magazines, there's television commercials, there's all of these dollars spent on marketing often simply to try to get you to covet something. Why do these individuals want you to covet something? The reason why they want you to covet something is because if you covet enough to get what they want you to get, then they will be able to fulfill their covetous desires. And so it's kind of a vicious circle. The reason why they want you to covet is because they are coveting. And, you know, people sometimes don't even realize this vicious cycle. And some might say, well, you know, is there anything wrong in trying to improve or progress? Of course not. In fact, Paul says, if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. So we do have to provide for ourselves, for our families. But the problem lies in wanting excessively the things of this earth. One author said, covetousness is described by a person that uses his life looking for things in the mud of materialism. The problem with covetousness, one of the problems, big problems that the Lord doesn't like about it, is covetousness by definition makes you feel unsatisfied. And the Lord really wants us to be happy. And when we covet, we actually want more and more. And in that way, we can actually destroy our lives. Someone asked Rockefeller, a very wealthy individual in America, how much is enough to make you feel satisfied? His answer, just a little bit more. And you know, after you get that little bit more, it's not enough. And you continue to need more. And you live an unsatisfied life. Now, a few years ago, there was a study of happiness in the United States. The question was asked, who is the happiest? Men or women? What age do you think is the happiest age? Well, the Pew Research Center did the survey. The happiest age group is men 65 and older. The least happy, men 18 to 29. Now, often we think the young people are the happiest individuals. I actually give a talk. I've given a talk to corporations, secular corporations, called Life Begins at 60. Because often the most abundant, gratifying times are when you are over 60. Because you can do the things that you want to do more. You can also have an influence over your children and grandchildren. And some of the most creative individuals have accomplished the most in their lives over the age of 65. And a lot of people that are young don't understand this, and thus they end up not living healthful lives. As a physician, I can tell you one of the biggest complaints I get for those over the age of 60 who are not happy is, if I would have realized I was going to live this long, I would have taken better care of myself. So in order for you to really be happy over 65, you have to be healthy. And that means you need to be on a good lifestyle now. It turns out married men are happier than single men. But interestingly, I should just mention this. Interestingly, single women in America are actually a little bit happier than married women. But yet, when there's relationships starting to form, often the one who wants to push it towards marriage is the woman, and the man is holding back. But the woman, according to this research, has the most to lose by saying, I do. Now, I should mention this as well. The happiest women on the planet in South Africa, as well as in America, are virtually all married. But the unhappiest women are also virtually all married. And if you average it out, the single woman is actually a little bit happier than the married women, because there's a lot of unhappy married women. College grads are happier than those without a college degree. This was something that surprised the Pew Research Center, but they found out people who are religious are happier than those who aren't religious. People who work are happier than those who don't. And people just think, you know, if I didn't have to go to work, I could be a lot happier. But in reality, work is part of happiness. And in the United States, people in the South are happier than those in the North part of the United States. Now, that might have to do with more sunlight and the advantages of light. Now, often we get into unhappiness because we confuse needs with wants. And yes, it's okay to be happy as long as we get there the healthy way. If we get there the healthy way, we can truly be happy individuals. But one of the things that has a relationship to happiness, in fact, it probably the strongest relationship to happiness, is how well our frontal lobe is functioning. And during this camp meeting, I'm going to be talking about how to enhance your general intelligence, but also how to enhance your emotional intelligence. And where those two things come together is in the frontal lobe of the brain. And so tonight I'm going to be talking about intelligence and its relationship to the frontal lobe. But your intelligence is your capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. Now, it sounds pretty simple, but there's a lot involved in that. Capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. Now, one of the things that we have been doing, is mentioned in the introduction, is we treat people with severe depression and anxiety. When you have a mental health problem, do you think it affects your capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge? It does. It can significantly affect it. In fact, the depression and anxiety can be so severe that you're no longer, if you're in school, you're no longer able to make good grades. And you're no longer able to remember what you're reading. When you get to the bottom of the page, you're no longer able to remember what you read at the top of the page. And that can be a significant issue. Our studies, we have been treating people with depression and anxiety for a number of years, but our studies indicate that not only does their depression and anxiety get better through lifestyle changes, but their memory significantly improves. And in fact, people without depression and anxiety, if they get on a good program, they can dramatically improve their capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. We've had people who've not been able to get into medical school after coming to our program. They then can take the tests to be able to get into medical school and do very well as a result of their improved capacity. Often we measure it by an IQ test, this capacity. The IQ test is the best measurement available now, but it's not a perfect measurement. It's about 20% of people that it will grossly either overestimate or underestimate their actual capacity, but it's good for about 80% of us. And intelligence, of course, is related somewhat to academic performance. If you have emotional intelligence as well, it will be very much related to academic performance. Emotional intelligence involves motivation as well, and some people that have high IQ are not well motivated and they don't do as well in school. College graduates' first job after graduation in America has been found to be related to their IQ. And so this is why people with high IQ like to go to Harvard and Yale and the Ivy League schools, because if they do well in those schools and that they're at the top, they get the best jobs out of college with the highest income. But how far you advance in that job no longer is related to your IQ. You get the job because of your IQ, but you advance in jobs because of your EQ or your emotional intelligence, which we'll talk about later this week. There are advantages of higher intelligence. You're more efficient in studying. You can live a balanced life even though it's an academic rigorous program. You're more creative. In fact, studies show that you have to have an above average intelligence to be truly creative. We'll talk about what creativity is here in a minute. You're more logical. You're more persuasive. And as a result, your influence goes up significantly. In fact, there are people that have very high intelligence that governments are very fearful of because of their ability to be persuasive. And I'm sure you're aware that in New York City at the United Nations, there are certain government leaders that have such a high intelligence that they're very fearful of them speaking at the colleges and universities there if their philosophy significantly goes against our own government's philosophy. And so one of the disadvantages of being highly intelligent is that you can become very feared by certain officials who have a hard time being able to counteract your logic. You're more likely to become wealthy. Now, we mentioned money does not equal happiness, and as a result, a lot of people with high intelligence don't prioritize money. It's not even in their top 10 lists. But if it is a high priority and you are highly intelligent, then you're much more likely to become wealthy. And in fact, even in this country, if you come up with a product that is creative, original, and useful to others, it'll be far better than winning the biggest lottery in the world as far as your wealth is concerned. And of course, you not only have to have the idea to put up the product, but you have to have the work ethic to see that product to completion as well. Now, another advantage, this was a long-term study, 862 men and women, published by Harvard. The researchers found that up to the cutoff point of 163, participants' risk of dying during a given period decreased as their IQ increased. For example, those with a childhood IQ of 150 had a 44% lower risk of death than those with an IQ of 135. Now, the average is 100, so 135 is very intelligent, but if you raise it up to 150, you will actually live significantly longer. You'll also have a higher quality of life. Now, you might ask, why is that the case? And we'll answer this we'll have one answer, I think, tonight, and then we'll have another answer tomorrow. But there is two answers starting to surface from the medical literature why IQ and longevity are related. Now, as we talk about intelligence, it involves more than just the frontal lobe. The temporal lobe is where our memory is centered. This is right there behind the ear. Our occipital lobe is where visual spatial orientation is centered. How good of an architect you are naturally and being able to see things like that has a lot to do with your occipital lobe. Your parietal lobe is where calculation, division, subtraction occur. It's also where your speech, verbal and declarative speech and IQ as far as your vocabulary is concerned. Cerebellum is your coordination center. When sports teams get together to compete, what they are actually determining is which team has the most corporately developed cerebellum at the time the match is made. Now, they don't realize that's what they're doing, but that's precisely what they're doing. And the frontal lobe of the brain is where IQ and EQ come together. This is a center of a number of functions that we'll talk about here in a minute. Now, human beings are not the only intelligent creatures. There are intelligent creatures such as cats, but only 3.5% of a cat brain is in the frontal lobe. Now, I should mention this. Guyton's textbook of physiology states that the frontal lobe of the brain is the seat of spirituality, morality, and the will. That's why it's mentioned there in Revelation 22, verse 4. And I don't know if you've noticed, at least in America, not much morality in a cat. If you've seen a cat actually enjoy torturing its victims to death. By the way, anyone who enjoys torture, it's a sign of significant frontal lobe compromise. It cannot occur in someone that has an intact frontal lobe. Dogs have a little more frontal lobe. 7% of their brain is in the frontal lobe. They won't hesitate to murder if they have to, so they're not extremely moral creatures, but they do it much more empathetically. They don't enjoy torture at all, and they're much more trainable due to their frontal lobe. Chimpanzees have the most of any other animal species, 17%. But what sets us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom is our frontal lobe size. 33 up to 38% of our brain is in the frontal lobe, and that's what gives us the ability to accomplish advanced planning and thinking. It's what helps us choose our own destiny, and I think that's what the Lord was talking about in Genesis chapter 1 when he said, "Let us create man in our image." It was really in that image as far as advanced planning and thinking, being able to be creative creatures, and to have that moral compass as well. Now, as mentioned, this is Guyton's textbook of physiology. Scientific studies show the frontal lobe is the seat of spirituality, morality, and the will. But it also involves other factors. We now know when the frontal lobe is compromised, of course, there's an impairment of moral principle. If we want to follow the decline of morality in society, we have to look at the frontal lobe of the brain. That means the frontal lobe function is going down. There's a social impairment that occurs. It's natural to love your family members, but if that natural love for family is gone, often it's due to a frontal lobe problem. Lack of foresight occurs. Our ability to reason from cause to effect is a frontal lobe phenomenon. But in addition to that, our ability to be able to see and accurately predict the future is a frontal lobe phenomenon. Now, in regards to that, you can actually follow your child's frontal lobe development by how far he or she is planning in the future. Do you know how long it takes the frontal lobe to be fully developed in human beings? Structurally developed in human beings? It's actually the last organ of the body to be structurally developed, and it takes 30 years to complete it. I think that's insightful when we realize the priests were not able to begin their priestly ministry, the Levites, until they were 30. Christ did not begin his ministry until 30. We would choose far better leaders if you could not vote until you were 30. Of course, that would be the case if the frontal lobes of people were well functioning over 30, because even adults can have problems with this. But just because the teenager has reached their adult size and weight does not mean that their brain is fully developed. And of course, thank God for that, because we realize for many teenagers, if that were the case, there'd be basically no hope for them the rest of their life. But you need to realize and take courage that there's still a lot more brain development to occur there, and so there is potential to be gained. Abstract reasoning is impaired significantly when the frontal lobe is compromised. Our ability to interpret proverbs, even our ability to interpret the symbols of Revelation, and to be able to think along those lines involves the frontal lobe of the brain. Mathematical understanding is diminished. We talked about calculation, division, subtraction being parietal lobe, but higher forms of math, higher forms of algebra, calculus require a frontal lobe. Empathy goes down when the frontal lobe is compromised. And in fact, studies show that if you don't have a well-functioning frontal lobe, you will not be able to really be empathetic with somebody else. Now, there are some psychologists, I mean, you've probably heard it said, I know it's a saying in America, in some instances where someone has gone through a lot of trauma and a lot of emotional hurt, someone will say there's no way you can understand what they've been through unless you've been in their shoes. And that actually is not a true statement for those that have a well-functioning frontal lobe. Studies show that those that have a well-functioning frontal lobe, even though they haven't been through any of that trauma, if they just hear about the trauma that an individual has gone through, they will be able to precisely feel the same emotions. And that's what empathy is. And as a result, they can actually help and be encouraged to significantly help others that are in need and have had trauma in those areas. Lack of restraint occurs when the frontal lobe is compromised. Boasting, hostility, these type of things become much more commonplace. And then there are character strengths that result from enhanced frontal lobe function. We mentioned creativity or ingenuity. The two essential components are being original as well as adaptive, making a positive contribution to the life of others. Now, you may stand on the shoulders of others who have been creative, and you can use their information, but you will still come up with a recipe for success that is completely original and actually very helpful to others. Interest is also part of the frontal lobe. It's actually fun to interact with someone who is intrigued by everything. In fact, the book Character, Strengths, and Virtue says if curiosity can be cultivated, no one need ever search for interesting experiences. One will simply have them. And so people who are bored very easily, those individuals, by definition, don't have a comprehensively good functioning frontal lobe. In fact, studies show that if you were confined to this room and you couldn't leave it for 24 hours, that if you had an intact frontal lobe, you would actually find something highly interesting in this room and begin to study it and be interested about it simply due to the fact that your frontal lobe is engaged. Judgment is part of a good frontal lobe, sometimes called critical thinking and rationality. And I could show you studies in America, but critical thinking and rationality is at an all-time low. Even college graduates, most of them have trouble sifting fact from fiction to be able to actually reconcile differing perspectives of an event and to be able to accurately compose that event. That's part of critical thinking. To be able to not be affected by appeals for emotion or political spin. Those things are at an all-time low simply due to the frontal lobe compromise that is starting to occur with increased regularity in society. But when you have good judgment and you're able to think critically, it feels good. It leads to good decisions and also leads to a coherent view of the world. Love of learning is part of the frontal lobe. We talked about wisdom, kindness or empathy, as well as social intelligence as part of the frontal lobe. Now, we need to mention a few things. Tomorrow morning, I will be going into enhancing your frontal lobe part 2, but this is kind of an introduction tonight. But I wanted to talk about several things that we can put into our body that impair the frontal lobe of the brain. Illicit drugs, whether it's amphetamines, whether it's cocaine, whether it's narcotics, whether it's marijuana, all of these addictive drugs have a suppressant effect on the frontal lobe of the brain. Some prescription drugs can also have a suppressant effect. This is why we have to weigh the benefits versus the risk of taking these drugs. What prescription drugs would these be? Well, there can be pain medicines like narcotics. There can be benzodiazepines, Xanax, Ativan, lorazepam, Valium type medicines. There's all sorts of different cousins of the benzodiazepines. Many people with anxiety are prescribed these medicines because they can make you feel less anxious, but in the process, they suppress the frontal lobe of the brain. This is why we have to come up with better solutions than medications, at least those medicines, for treating anxiety. Then there are legal drugs that impair. Alcohol affects the frontal lobe of the brain first before it affects any other portion of the brain. Now, if you were to drive, does anyone know what the legal limit of alcohol intoxication is in South Africa? Okay, 0.2%. In America, it's 0.08% now. But if you were to drive at the legal limit of alcohol intoxication in America, 0.08%, and a policeman were to pull you over, would you be able to walk a straight line? You actually could. You could converse normally, you could walk a straight line, and baseball players have proven this. I don't know if you have, I know you have cricket in South Africa. I heard about cricket matches today, somewhat similar to baseball. But in America, they say the hardest thing to do in all of sport is to hit a 95-mile-an-hour curveball out of a baseball park when it's being thrown from about 55 feet away. And even those under the influence of alcohol, if they're skilled at doing so, will be able to successfully do that. That's how good their coordination is at 0.08%. So why is it then that studies show that they're over 10 times as likely to get into an automobile accident? It's not their coordination. It's their judgment. And this is what happened to Princess Di's driver. He was walking normally. His cerebellar functions were fine. He was conversing normally. Nobody recognized he was drunk, but he attempted to negotiate a turn in a tunnel at a speed that was impossible to negotiate. That wreck has been well analyzed. The best race car driver in the world would not have been able to successfully negotiate that speed at that turn. And thus, he lost his life. The princess lost her life. Others lost their life as well. Now, once alcohol is out of the system, well, let me just ask you this. Does it take critical, abstract thinking to drive an automobile? Anyone want to venture a guess to that? Does it take critical, abstract thinking to drive an automobile? The answer is no. Otherwise, we wouldn't allow 16-year-olds to do it. And so the next day, Princess Di's driver, if he would have survived, would have been able to drive successfully if he hadn't had any more to drink. But for critical abstract thinking, studies show it takes 2 weeks to fully recover from alcohol. And this is why the FAA is re-examining their rule. They have a rule of no alcohol for 24 hours, but studies show that flying an airplane in instrument conditions, and by the way, when we landed in Johannesburg this morning, there was fog on the runway. And we had come 11 hours from London. He couldn't turn around and go back to London. And he had such a big airplane, it's an Airbus 380, one of those big double-deckers, that there's only a few runways around that will even take an airplane that heavy and that big. And so in instrument conditions, he landed the airplane in fog. It was a hard landing, and it shocked everybody in the airplane, but he got it down safely. Now, if under those instrument conditions, he would have had a couple of instruments go wrong and then had to land it safely, that's when it requires the critical abstract thinking. And of course, pilots are trained to be able to do that. They have to figure out which instruments are good, which instruments are not good, which ones to ignore, how to compensate for that, and it requires very critical abstract thinking. And whether you survive being in that airplane or not has a lot to do whether your pilot had anything to drink in the last 2 weeks. And so hopefully he hasn't in those type of conditions and can land the plane safely. Now, nicotine has a more subtle effect on the frontal lobe of the brain, but it also impairs the frontal lobe of the brain. And also the most commonly consumed drug, caffeine, has its effect. Caffeine actually is a drug that has been shown to increase your risk of gossiping. Now, the definition of gossip in the study was sharing private information with someone who's not part of the problem or part of the solution to the problem. So if you stick to that definition of gossip, studies show if you have caffeine on board, you're more likely to gossip than if you don't have caffeine on board. And interestingly, Ellen White actually mentioned this. She said when these tea and coffee users meet together for social entertainment, the effects of their pernicious habit are manifest. All partake freely of their favorite beverages, and as the stimulating influence is felt, notice how she described it. Their tongues are what? Loosened, and they begin the wicked work of talking against others. Their words are not few or well chosen. And that underscores another important factor of the frontal lobe of the brain. The frontal lobe is often an appropriate brake on human behavior. And, you know, we want to have a car that has a good engine, but it's also very important for it to have good brakes. And if our brain is working without brakes, that's a more dangerous situation to be in. And in fact, recently an article came out saying that caffeine is the silent killer of emotional intelligence. So it actually inhibits your ability to manage your own emotions significantly. But most people assume, because they're hooked on it, that it's necessary in their case, because without it, they feel like a zombie in the morning. Bristol University studied this recently in the United Kingdom, showing caffeine addiction is such a downer that regular coffee drinkers actually get no real pick-me-up from their morning habit. They found that they develop a tolerance to both the anxiety-producing and the stimulating effects of caffeine, meaning that it only brings them back to baseline levels of alertness, not above them. This was a nice prospective placebo-controlled trial on almost 400 adults. And the study's author said, although frequent consumers feel alerted by caffeine, especially by their morning tea, coffee, or other caffeine-containing drinks, evidence indicates that this is actually merely the reversal of the fatiguing effects of acute caffeine withdrawal. So what does this mean? Measurements showed that the caffeine users' post-caffeine levels of alertness were no higher than non-caffeine consumers who only received a placebo, suggesting caffeine only brings coffee drinkers back up to normal. In other words, all the reported benefits of caffeine are present virtually all day, only in those who don't consume it. So if you want to have the stimulating effects of caffeine and be alert the entire day, you need to make a decision to no longer consume it. And you'll actually have that alertness throughout the day. You'll be able to manage your emotions. You will not have as high a tendency to gossip, and you won't get yourself into trouble as much. Now, interestingly, there's another sport. We've mentioned baseball. We've mentioned cricket. But there's another sport that I don't think you have in this country, but in America, it's one of the most popular sports. It's called the National Football League. Here in South Africa, I think you have rugby. Now, I'm not as familiar with rugby, but in the National Football League, the quarterback coaches are telling the quarterback to consume 0 caffeine. Why is that the case? They're telling the linemen to load up on caffeine to try to tackle the quarterback. It turns out in the National Football League, there's only one person on the field that requires an intact frontal lobe. And that actually is the quarterback. Why is that the case? The quarterback is analyzing a lot of information, and he's the one that has to make the decision. And studies are showing that he makes a much better decision when caffeine is not on board. And if that's the case for quarterbacks on just throwing a football, what about us in regards to the day-to-day decisions that we're making and how we're being influenced by our emotions? Just to set this off, I want to show you a recent study by Paul Laurenti at Wake Forest University. And if our audio is hooked up, you might be able to hear this study. I don't think you have audio. I've got it through the HDMI cable, but that's okay. What he is showing is that this news broadcaster took 1 cup of coffee, got a functional MRI, and decreased the circulation in her brain by 40% just by consuming that 1 cup of coffee. And this is why a Christian lifestyle is actually an abstinent lifestyle. Peter said, "Wherefore gird up the loins of your mind." In other words, let's let our minds be as sharp as they possibly can be. And then he says this, be sober. The Greek word for being sober doesn't mean what it means in English. Sober means abstinent from alcohol. But the Greek word that he used for that that's translated sober actually just means to be abstinent in general. In other words, abstinent from anything that's going to adversely affect the ability of our brain to function. And then he says after that, be abstinent and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. An abstinent lifestyle is indeed a Christian lifestyle and can put us ahead in regards to the frontal lobe. Now, I would like to mention just one or two other things before we close on the frontal lobe, and we'll pick it up tomorrow. What does the frontal lobe desire for optimal function? Carbohydrates are used almost exclusively by the brain for optimal function. What foods have natural carbohydrates in them? Fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables. That original diet in Genesis chapter 1. Interestingly, Ellen White quotes those 4 food groups, and then she says this: they impart a strength, a power of endurance, and notice what else? A vigor of intellect that are not afforded by a more complex and stimulating diet. And indeed, studies are showing the connection there between intellect. Now, when carbohydrates were first found to be good for the brain, it was thought that sugar, being a carbohydrate, might be very good for the brain. But what happens when we eat a candy bar to our blood sugars? It skyrockets, and then our pancreas cranks out a lot of insulin, thinking that we've eaten a lot of fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables to take care of that meal, but then that brings down that blood sugar lower than it was before we ate the sugary substance. Once that occurs, it takes about 4 hours for the frontal lobe to fully recover. You can still memorize things, you can still learn things, but you can no longer apply them. So if you're having to problem solve on a test, you're not going to do as well. And studies clearly show this in both children and adults now. Large amounts of sugar in the diet have been demonstrated to impair frontal lobe functions in school-age children and in adults as well. This was an interesting study, largest study of its kind in children, 3, 4, 7, and 8.5-year-olds. They were controlled for known factors that can affect IQ, and those with the 20% highest processed diets, higher in sugar and fats, had a 5-point lower IQ than those who ate a more health-conscious diet with most fruits, vegetables, salad, pasta, and rice. That can make it a letter difference in grade performance. But if you would look at the top 1% who are not eating any meat and not consuming any sugar, there was a significantly improved IQ in those individuals of 10 to 15 points, and that's a very statistically significant amount. Arachidonic acid is one of the problems with flesh foods. Arachidonic acid decreases the synthesis and storage of acetylcholine. It also actually worsens our emotional intelligence, our ability to manage our emotions, and it causes inflammation in the brain itself, as well as in other joints and other tissues. And arachidonic acid is present largely in flesh foods. Ellen White says eating much flesh will diminish intellectual activity. Students would accomplish much more in their studies if they never tasted meat. When the animal part of the human nature is strengthened by meat eating, the intellectual power diminishes proportionately. This study was an interesting study done in Phoenix, Arizona, recently published in the journal Nutrition, showing that vegetarian men and women had significantly better scores on depression and anxiety stress scale. The depression and anxiety stress scale in women were 20 for the meat eaters, called omnivores, 10 for vegetarians. This was just a cross-sectional study, and that's a very significant difference. Half of the 20 score, and in men, average was 12.5 for the omnivores and 5 for vegetarians, so even less than half. They followed up their study on an interventional study and showed that even though you're an omnivore, if you change over to a plant-based diet, within 2 weeks, your scores will improve. So it doesn't take long for the brain to recover from this and for you to do better as far as your mental health is concerned. Then in the British Medical Journal, they studied it the opposite way. Children with high IQs are more likely to become vegetarians when they grow up. A study of more than 8,000 men and women aged 30 whose IQs have been measured when they were 10 showed that the higher the IQ, the greater the odds of becoming a vegetarian. For each 15-point rise in IQ scores in the study, the likelihood of being a vegetarian rose by 38%, and this was even after adjusting for factors such as social class and education. The link was still consistent. Now, it was interesting to actually look at the discussion of the study. They were saying, why? We know that when you become a vegetarian, your IQ goes up. But this is taking a look at children with differing IQs, and they found out if your IQ is higher as a child, you're more likely to actually make a choice to become a vegetarian at age 30. And in their discussion, they said, well, let's get back to the definition of intelligence. You remember the definition of intelligence? Your capacity to do what? Learn, retain, and apply knowledge. And so they said what we're measuring is the capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. And so if they have that, they're more likely to discover in their learning that a plant-based diet is better for them, and they're more likely to retain that knowledge, and then they're more likely to apply that knowledge in their life. So for those of you that are vegetarian, I know sometimes I get asked this. I'll be eating with a group of doctors, and they know that I'm into mental health, but they don't necessarily know I'm into diet. And so I'll be eating at a mental health conference, and they often ask me as they see me ordering about my vegetarian diet, and they'll often ask the question, why are you a vegetarian? Well, as a result of that study, now I can just give a quick 2-word answer: high IQ. Actually, I've never said that. I've been tempted to say it. But if I did say it, it would show some low emotional intelligence. But nonetheless. Physical exercise is also important for the brain. And so it's not only what we put into our body, it's what we do with our body. And interestingly, working with one's own hands in a real-world 3D environment is actually imperative for full cognitive and intellectual development. And of course, the disappointing thing about this is there are a lot of schools who have canceled car mechanic classes. They've canceled music lessons. And many kids today are learning things only in a two-dimensional environment, their computer screen. And that actually shows to diminish intellectual capacity. We're actually meant to be able to work with our hands in 3D. And if we work with our hands in 3D, even washing dishes, for instance, it will actually improve the circulation of the frontal lobe of our brain, because our hand motion is actually in the back part of our brain. And there's a type of physical activity with our hands that actually enhances the emotional intelligence somewhat. It actually improves serotonin levels, and it's actually called gardening. Even playing in the dirt with your hands, actually, because of our contact with a healthy bacteria in the dirt, actually improves serotonin levels. I may, since that's such an interesting study, I might bring that forward tomorrow. Now, before we close, sometimes we diminish the role of diet and health in what we're doing with our bodies, but we really shouldn't diminish this role. Ellen White says, few understand how much their habits of diet have to do with not only their health, but their characters, their usefulness in this world, and even their eternal destiny. She also mentions that many of our church trials and arguments that we have in our church are due to the fact that our frontal lobes are not enhanced enough. She doesn't use the term frontal lobes, but she says it's due to our judgment being down, our rationality being down, and she says much of that has to do with the diet of the church members. So the argument in the church board meeting may not be due to what you think it's due to. It may be due to what the people ate before they got to the board meeting. And so no matter how much you try to explain a subject, you won't come to the level of principle and empathy to be able to make a wise decision. And so this is an important reason, and one that we should not overlook, that God actually is interested. As he said in the Bible, whatever you eat, whatever you drink, do it how? Do it all the glory of God. And in fact, our only way that we can communicate with God, it's clear, is the frontal lobe of the brain. When the frontal lobes are removed from human beings, their spirituality is done. They no longer have any interest whatsoever in spiritual things. They will not want to attend church. They won't want to have any type of activity in that regard at all. And so, I don't know about you, but I'm interested in having my brain being in the best shape as possible. And I think for us to be the type of Christians the Lord wants us to be, he wants us to practice a lifestyle that is conducive to having our brain sharp, having that capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge, and to manage our emotions effectively so that we can have good relationships, proper motivation, and to win others to this cause of good as well, and to the Lord's cause. Let us bow our heads as we close. Our Father in heaven, we thank you that you told us a long time ago that wisdom is better than rubies. And all that we might desire, whatever that is not to be compared to wisdom. I pray that each one here tonight will make the choice in their daily activities, in their daily lives, to choose what will enhance wisdom in our relationship with you. And I thank you for hearing and answering this prayer. In Jesus' name, amen.